Hi, I'm Adam Drake from Team Losi Racing, and today I'm going to go over some of the little tips and tricks that I do when I'm cleaning my 5T. As you can see here, I have some of the cleaning supplies that I use. So basically I'm going to just take apart a few of the different parts and show you how I kind of grease and maintain the parts in my Losi 5T. Okay, so the first thing I do is remove the body. That way I can get to everything on the truck pretty easy. Then I'll take an air compressor and just blow off any of the big chunks of dirt, mud, dust, anything that's on there. As you can see, the truck's still pretty dirty, but just to get all the main stuff off, that way it makes it a little bit easier and cleaner to where when you start to maintain the vehicle. Okay, so starting here at the front of the vehicle, first thing I did was just remove the shocks. But the first thing I do before I do any maintenance to the shocks is I just want to make sure that the arms move up and down freely. I'll take the captured ends, just grab the turnbuckle, just make sure everything moves freely, and again that the suspension arms move up and down, just to ensure that you don't have a bent hinge pin or anything like that. You don't want to do all this maintenance and get it all back together and then find out something's bound up. So now that I have the front shocks off and know that everything's working properly or moving freely with the front end, now I'll move on to maintaining the front shocks. Okay, so with the shock removed from the truck, first thing you want to check for is to check if there's any rips or tears in the shock boot. The shock boot's actually very, very important on any vehicle, especially the 5T though, just because you run in so many dusty, just dirty conditions. If you end up having a tear in the shock boot, it can end up causing wear and damage to your shock shafts, the O-rings, and even if enough just dusty, dirty dirt gets into the oil, it can even scar the inside of the shock bodies. So you really just want to just take the shock boot, just kind of pull it back a little bit, see if there's any little rips or tears, and if there is, you'll just then remove the shock boot just for a little bit further checking, to see how the shock shaft looks. You can always polish the shock shaft up a little bit if you want, if it's just some little nicks and scars, but if you have an excessive amount of dirt or dust in here, you'll want to completely disassemble the shock, replace the O-rings, and then just use a little bit of the Losi green shock oil grease. Put fresh oil and a new set of shock boots and you should be ready to go. Okay, so I removed the whole front clip from the truck. I still have the shocks off to the side, but these are complete. Went ahead and replaced the shock boots. I did have a few little small rips and tears, but everything around the bottom cartridge still looked good, so I didn't replace the O-rings or the oil, just shock boots. And now I'm on to the front end. So the first thing I check is the grease boot for the front center drive shaft. We use a grease boot on both the front center and the center rear drive shaft. And just like with the shocks, it's really, really important to make sure that this has no rips or tears, because any dust or dirt gets in there with this being such a high speed, high temp moving part. Any dust or dirt gets in there and it works like sandpaper. So just check the boot by pulling it back and rotating it. Make sure that there's no rips or tears. This boot looks great. So the next thing I'm going to do is just pull the boot back. You can see the grease in there. It all still looks clean, but I'm going to go ahead and just put a little bit more grease just to ensure that it's down in there really good. Then you can just go ahead and slide this grease boot back on. You want to make sure that it's pushed all the way forward, so it's wrapped around that coupler really good. Just kind of rotate it, let the grease work itself around. And then now I'm going to move on to the spindle, because same thing. We don't use a grease boot, but it's a moving part, so we want to make sure that the front drive axles have grease in there. It'll just help the parts last longer. And then while doing so, we'll also check the bearings in the front spindles to make sure that there's no problems or that it's not gritty. So we'll just remove the set screws from the spindle here. Then we'll pop the kingpins out. Pull the whole spindle assembly, and then I'll just set the rest of the front end off to the side here. So you can see here there's a lot of dust, dirt, grime all in the front drive shaft area. from this being greased previously. So what I'll do is I'll actually take and I'll pull the hub and drive shaft out, and then I'll go ahead and I'll take and spray off with some Dynamite motor spray. Just spray all the old grease and grime and everything off. And then I'll check both inner and outer bearings just to make sure everything's free. If those are gritty at all, do the same thing. I'll just spray the bearings out really good. And then the next step, I'll show you how I grease the drive shaft and also grease the bearings. All right, so I went ahead and disassembled the front spindle. I pulled both inner and outer bearings out. I've already sprayed the drive shaft out just to get any of the old grease or any dust or dirt out. And then I also went ahead and removed the seal on one side of both the inner and outer bearing. It's pretty easy to do. You can just get under there with an X-Acto knife and pop the seal out. I went ahead and then sprayed the bearings out. So now I'm just going to take, you can use either the Losi black grease or the HD ring and pinion grease. Both work really good. You'll just take a little bit of the grease, squirt it down into the bearing. I usually do it in like 3 or 4 spots around the bearing. Then you'll just kind of work the bearing around and then just make sure that like your thumb's clean and just kind of force push a little bit of the grease down in there. Make sure that the bearing's really free. And then you'll just go ahead and snap the seal back into the bearing. Kind of the more grease, the better. You know, some of it may kind of squirt and ooze out a little bit, but that's not gonna hurt anything. Go ahead and do the same process for the larger inner bearing. Now, if your bearing's really gritty after you've sprayed it out, you know, it may just be time to go ahead and replace it. In this case, the bearings still feel pretty good, so just some fresh grease and I should be good to go. Same thing with the drive shaft. You can run these dry, but you'll extend the life by just putting a little bit of grease into the drive shaft. And then what I do just to kind of make it easier is I'll take the inner bearing, slide it over the axle, and then just kind of rotate the drive shaft just to kind of work that grease around. You can then take your towel, wipe off any of the excess grease just so you don't have it flinging out and then kind of all over the spindle. You'll do the same process throughout the vehicle, front and rear. I just did the left side of the front of the truck. Now I'll go to the right side front of the truck, and then next is onto the rear end where I'll do the same thing, checking the rear hub bearings and then also greasing the drive shafts. All right, so I've assembled the front of the truck and I've also moved on to the rear end. Pull the shocks off the rear end, check to make sure that the arms and everything moved free, grab the turnbuckles, make sure that the camber link ends rotated free, pull the drive shafts out, check the bearings, just like we did with the front. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the differentials. The differentials aren't something that need to be serviced every time you run, but it's always good to check. It's easiest to check around the center diff, make sure that there's no leaking or seeping of the fluid. If there is, you'll want to take the diffs apart. And I always, if I'm going to service the diffs and take them apart, I generally always replace the O-rings and also the gasket just to be safe. If you're going to go and tear into the truck that much to where you're going to get the diffs out and service them, it's really cheap to just get fresh O-rings and gaskets. But one thing that's very, very important that I think a lot of guys overlook is making sure that you grease the O-rings really good, and then also greasing the out drives and the diff case and even the ring gear. You can again use either the Losi black grease or the HD ring and pinion grease. But on the out drive, there's actually a little groove. Well, this is actually a grease groove. So you'll want to make sure that you apply grease all the way around the out drive to fill that groove. You know, you can wipe off any excess. And then I also, on the diff case and even on the ring gear, I'll just put a little bit of grease around the inside where the out drive goes in. And then you'll just take the out drive. I don't have the bearing on here, but you should if I was actually building this to put in the truck. But you'll slide the out drive in, kind of work the grease around, and then you'll have a little bit of excess grease on the outdrive here. So I'll just take the O-ring, kind of take that excess grease, work that grease around on the O-ring. You just really want to make sure that this O-ring is able to do its job and seal the diff so that no grease can come out. And then you'll go ahead and finish assembling your diff and bolt it back in the truck. All right, so the basic maintenance on the vehicle is done. Now I'm on to the engine. Two things that are really important with the vehicle is your clutch and also your clutch bearings. The clutch, there's very little maintenance needed, but one thing that you do want to check for is wear. Pretty much the clutch is good to go unless the shoe is worn to where it's within a millimeter of the metal where the shoe is actually bonded. Other than that, you just kind of dust off, make sure that the clutch wear isn't too much and it's ready to go. The other thing is the clutch bearings. Basically, you'll just pull off the clutch assembly and just feel with your hands, just see how the bearings feel. The only difference with this versus the rest of the bearings on the car is you don't want to pop these seals off and pack them full of grease. A little bit of light oil is okay, but if you put grease in there, when it gets hot, it flings out and it allows the clutch to slip and it'll cause the clutch to wear a lot. So a little bit of light oil like Mobil 1 or just a light bearing oil, but you don't want to put too much. The other thing is your air filter. Always want to make sure you have a clean air filter. You can get foam filter cleaner from like a motorcycle shop and clean the filter. I recommend just replacing the filter just because it's really difficult to get all the dust and dirt out of the filter. And any of that dust and dirt that doesn't get cleaned out, it gets sucked through the engine and it can cause your engine to wear out. So what I do is I just take both filters, some filter oil, and then you'll just really want to coat fairly heavy the foam, work all the way around. Don't be afraid to put too much oil because you can always wring it out. And then I'll just take a plastic bag, put the filter in, and just work it around until you have like a really even consistency of the oil. I did this to where the one side isn't very heavy, just so I can kind of show you. But you want to have a consistent look with the oil. If you have an area where the foam still has its just natural color, you can always just go back, put a little bit of extra oil in that area, and drop the filter back into the bag and just work it around again. And even if you end up where you have too much oil to where the filter is really saturated, you can always just take a clean paper towel or just a clean towel and wring the filter out. I oil both the inner and outer element. Some guys just do the inner, some do both. And then I also use the Losi pre-filter that we use on the outside. That'll just help keep any like big chunks of dust and dirt out of the engine. But very, very important, every time you hit the track, or at least every day that you hit the track, always just make sure you pull your pre-filter off and just check and make sure that the filter's not clogged so that you keep your engine running consistent. All right, thanks for joining me today. And if you have any other questions or just need any other information, you can always refer back to the manual, or you can also check www.losi.com.